Hello and welcome to Perspectives. I'm Lian Peck. It's been a time of breathtaking change for Myanmar, which has gone from pariah state to international darling virtually overnight. Having traded in his general's uniform for a suit and tie, President Thein Sein introduced a slew of reforms that took the world by surprise, not least of which a landmark by-election last year that saw Aung San Suu Kyi elected to parliament. But lately, this picture of progress has been marred by reports of ethnic violence and abuses by the still powerful military, sparking debate on whether the international community was too quick to welcome Myanmar back in from the cold. Did the giddy promise of reform blind the world to the complex realities of Myanmar? What now for this turnaround story? Well, joining me today to discuss this is Noeleen Heyzer, United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary of the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific; Tin Maung Tan, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies; So Mint, Chief Editor of Mazima News, student activist in the 1988 uprising, and a former exiled journalist in New Delhi who's recently returned to Myanmar; and Kirsten Doyle, Myanmar Program Manager at the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Now, let's start off with the recent military airstrikes on the Kachin militias in the north, a real shocker for the international community, which has been hailing Myanmar for all its reforms. What is going on here? Is President Thein Sein backpedaling on his pledge to end ethnic conflict, you think, or is the military acting independently here? Let's start with you, Noeleen.
Well, one has to realize that there have been many ceasefires now with many different ethnic groups. And at this particular time, you have the highest political will to make a difference. The challenge is twofold. First, you have to ensure that the ceasefires that have been already agreed to could be converted into a political reform agenda, one that involves a more inclusive political dialogue, one where there is a peace dividend for all stakeholders, and where there is jobs and also opportunities for the local communities. I think in the case of the Kachin, it's the most difficult area. And therefore, I mean, there was a ceasefire 17 years ago. It did not hold. And therefore, you need to begin to build trust. You need to understand the conflict economies. And it is a violence on both sides. So you need to seize to prevent this violence. But at the same time, you need to engage with a political agenda. And I was very, very pleased that last week, the president himself actually put on the table the fact that he wants a political dialogue.
Well, a lot of people are seeing, Thein Sein as sounding pretty insincere about peace. Now, the question remains as to whether he authorized the escalation of the campaign here, or really was the military acting on their own accord here? Because after the offensive, we know the president himself had said he praised the army for its, quote, sacrifices in blood and sweat, saying it's done everything possible to contribute to the peace process. Have they really? So Min, let's start with you.
I think international community got the attention because of the airstrike. In fact, these fightings, there has been a civil war in the country for years. We have to recognize that this is a question of nationalities. This is a question of many ethnic nationalities that have lived there, that have fought for their own rights and for their self-determination for years. And the president, the present government, he is making really efforts to deal with this question of nationalities. Of course, we also have to accept that the military is a separate institution, it's a strong institution, it's a historic institution in the country. It's its own setup, it's its own history. So when the country is in the democratization process, and we also have to accept that this is just the beginning of the democratization. So when the country is in the democratization, the questions, including the question of how to deal with the question of nationalities, are coming up. So that got the international attention.
Sure.
Good thing is that the government, from the military side, there was an airstrike, but this is the ongoing question.
Well, you seem to be suggesting that really these are teething problems on the ground, but the fact that the military used airstrikes, and this is a tactic which we didn't even see under military rule, can one say therefore that we're looking at a military in Myanmar which has gone back to its bad old ways? Tin.
Well, first, we should remember that according to the Constitution, the president is not the supreme commander. So that's a separation of power in one way, within the military and the executive. And then, of course, the airstrikes can be seen as an escalation, right? On the other hand, from the field command itself, it may not be seen as an escalation. This is the problem. So it is, I think, a matter of whether you are following the orders or not. That is the big question being asked. And I think it is a kind of a liberal interpretation of defensive action, because in military terms, defensive is also offensive in one way. And you look at the way the military justifies it. The military justifies it by saying that the KIO has gone on to hit civilian targets. That means infrastructure. And from the perspective of the KIO, they see that it is a way of defensive action to prevent the forces from reaching their areas. So I think this is a big problem. And it goes back again to trust. You don't really trust not to fight and to keep your arms. Why are you keeping arms in the first place? Because you don't trust. That is a chicken and egg kind of problem going on. But I think it doesn't go very well for the president's words, of course, this to happen. It's a very unfortunate thing, and I don't think it will happen soon again.
Well, how sincere, Kirsten, do you think Myanmar's government is about reconciliation and peace? Because obviously, again, the skeptics are saying these peace deals also have to do really with a lot of money and a lot of business, and the fact that both the military and the Kachin really want to secure, the rich resources in that state. Hence, this reconciliation.
I think the main issue is that there's still the separation between the government and the military control is actually a good thing. It's a new thing. But Thein Sein is probably glossing over the fact that he precisely doesn't control the military. And it seems the military is acting very much on its own account. And this is why we are not seeing peace. But the other problem is that the government has not ever put everybody on the same table when it comes to the ethnic nationality groups. They're separate, they're trying to reach separate agreements with separate groups, they're at different stages, and that is what has happened in the previous decades as well. So in that regard, there is not enough progress, and I think everybody should come to the table together.
Yeah, well, speaking of putting all the ethnic minorities on the same table, I mean, how is it that the Myanmar government has been able to strike deals and agreements with the other ethnic minorities like the Shan and the Karen, and it's been so difficult to do the same with the Kachin? Nolene?
You know, the thing is that this is the first time the government has undergone 3 waves of reform. They have gone through the political and reconciliation side. They are now looking at the economic and the social side, and they also want clean governance, basically, as the 3rd wave. I think the whole thing is, when they are dealing with these groups, there's also the whole issue of political engagement. How do you actually reach the whole situation of making sure that there is a peace dividends, that these 100 nationalities and more are able to share in prosperity, but also share in power, come to the decision-making table, and it's not an easy process. I mean, there has been tension for so many years, there's been conflict for so many years, but the fact is that for the first time, there's real leadership, bold, encourages leadership to engage with these minorities and to make them part of the national agenda. And I think what the president said is very, very clear. It has to be this agenda of reform has to be within the context of a culture of patience, of tolerance, but also the whole issue of inclusive political dialogue, inclusive development, and the peace dividend has to be shared. And it has to be on both sides.
Well, is the government really re-engaging the Kachin, you think? I mean, are they really open to finding a long-term solution, a political solution, which really goes beyond a ceasefire and troop withdrawals and really acceding to some of these demands and hearing these demands for political representation?
I think it is very clear that the government wants the fighting to be stopped. Very clear. The government wants ceasefire to take place. But it should go, for me, it should go beyond that, not having just a ceasefire. Of course, I understand the government has its 3 steps program, but it is not it is not that you are going to have these, because you have to include, it has to be inclusive. You have to include the nationalities in all the process, the whole process. You are not going to have a ceasefire just because you like to bring them into the parliament, because again, the distrust, the ethnic nationalities look at them because you want them to be in the parliament, in your frame. So that has to be dealt with politically. When I say politically, that has to be also dealt by the military. Military has to accept that Myanmar is a nation of diverse nationalities, and we have to give due respect, equality for every nationalities in the country.
Tin, let me put that to you. Would you agree with this? The fact that, you know, this is the acid test for democratization. The army and the government needs to recognize these demands.
This is a structural problem as well because of the Constitution. So unless the Constitution issue is tackled, it will be like a chicken and egg problem. And I think that the unitary nature of the Myanmar state, that has been there for so long, that people mindsets are stuck to this unitary state. Federalism was a dirty word until a few months ago. But people don't understand what federalism means. And the only thing that the military has been drilled into was federalism means separatism, which the ethnic peoples were saying, no, it's not. It's more autonomy. But words like autonomy are very, very difficult to interpret. It depends on whom you ask and what you want. So that has to be tackled too. And this has to be put on the table. In fact, it was quite positive when U Min, the chief negotiator, was saying to the Kachins in the recently that, okay, if we want to talk about political dialogue before ceasefire, we are willing to talk. Let's find a place and a time. And I think they had put that on the table, and the Kachins has not yet responded. But UNFC, United Nationalities Federal Council, seems to have taken that up. So apparently, they want to go as a group as UNFC rather than Kachin itself, which the government have not responded to that particular way of approach. So I think this is in the works, but I don't know how long it takes. And apparently, the government still believes that ceasefire should be the first thing. And that, if that can be sort of somehow transcended for the greater aim, and of course, tone down the conflict level, you know, maybe there's a way out.
All right. Well, we're discussing, you know, whether or not Myanmar can find a political solution to the Kachin problem. We've got to take a short break now. Join us when we come back. Thanks for staying with us on Perspectives. Now, we were talking about the offensive against the Kachin, and we know that that hasn't been the only dampener on reform. Last November, we saw some 70 monks and villagers. I mean, they were hurt when the police actually quashed their protests against the expansion of this billion-dollar Wanbao copper mine, which is a joint venture between the Chinese and the Myanmar military. Now, while far smaller in scale, a lot of people were saying that this was reminiscent of how the government sort of tackled the Saffron Revolution in 2007. Is that an overstatement, you think? Kirsten, let's start with you.
Well, I think we have all been looking at 2012 thinking, finally people are protesting, and that is probably the most obvious sign that the end of fear or the diminishing of fear, that people actually go out on the streets, and it was more or less non-violent also from the response from the authorities. And then the copper mine protest, it definitely went bad. And I think the main problem is everywhere are Chinese interests involved. So this is something that is always in the background. Everywhere protests have happened, directly or indirectly, Chinese interests are endangered. And that also brings me to the point that who are the biggest derailers of the reform process? China, who's losing out big time. Basically everybody who has had advantages under the previous regime.
So are you saying essentially that the military is still protecting the interests of the Chinese here in Myanmar, or was it a case of another reading being that, you know, essentially the government didn't know how to handle the protests? It has legalized protests in the country, but it didn't know how to handle the uprising in the sort of the new era.
I see two things. One is there is definitely a business interest of the military along with the China's business interests in that particular issue. And but we cannot equate this issue like what has happened in Rakhine State or in Kachin State. This issue is for me how the democratic government, a new democratic government, a newborn democratic government handles a kind of the people's protest. For me, that is the question. Definitely, those in the government are trying really hard to handle such protests, because in the country now, protests are there everywhere, because this is the time now you can protest. What do you expect after all these years of repression? Now people want to protest. But how that would be handled in democratically, peacefully, non-violently, that is the question.
Is that too kind of reading, you think? I mean, the fact that Somin is saying that they have kicked their dictatorial habits, it's just that they're not sure how to handle the new era.
There's actually a different issue. What has been decided in Naypyidaw doesn't really reach to the far-flung areas. So you have local authorities and security who simply continue doing their own thing. And they don't really respect what's being decided in the center. So it might be a lack of communication, a lack of understanding, and of course, there is no security sector reform. The simple police hasn't been retrained either.
Nolene, would you agree?
I actually see this as the opening up of a democratic space. The fact that the president responded in such a positive way was actually unbelievable on so many levels. And therefore, it is one of the, one sees the strengthening of citizens' agency, if you like. And this is part of the democratic process. The whole issue now is what type of investment should we ask, and should there be pressure on to support the economic and social reform that the country is undergoing. Yeah. We have to make sure that these investments are more development-oriented. And the whole region, ASEAN, the international community, China, India, Thailand, we all have to make sure that the nature and the quality of the investment generates jobs, does not destroy our natural resource base, will actually provide the livelihoods of the people, will invest in smallholder agriculture, because 70% of the people are still in the rural areas. They have to actually make sure that that there is shared prosperity and shared power. And I think
before we get to that, I mean, a lot of the critics are saying, and the skeptics were saying, that this is the sort of thing, I mean, these conflicts are exactly the thing which they were warning the international community about, you know, really not to get too excited over the changes that were taking place. Do you think that the international community really has been too fast in bestowing legitimacy on Myanmar and lifting the sanctions so quickly?
I don't think we should link that too much in a sense, because, you know, these kind of protests and this kind of suppression happens. I mean, I'm not trying to be defending the atrocities that happen. They are bad. But it happens everywhere in the world. In Africa, Malaysia, I mean, about this anti-rare earth movement in Malaysia, the only thing is that it went bad because of the way the demonstration has been dispersed, right? So it's just a tactical issue as well. The issue of whether the UMEHL and the contract between the Chinese is a different issue. It is a bad contract, perhaps, but contracts are contracts. So it is the dilemma of the investigation commission, too, about that. But what do you do when you have a protest which inhibits work, or whatever you call it? Of course, theoretically, according to the new law, you have to ask for permission. But if you ask for permission, you won't get it for that particular protest. So they did protest. So what does the government do? According to the letter of the law, you have to disperse that somehow. You have to give them orders and say, okay, you go away. They don't go away. What do? Forcefully remove them. And how do you do it is another issue. So that is the kind of the thing, I think. Generally, the way the government operates is that if you break the law, you have to somehow to restore law and order.
But isn't this the sort of thing which would put foreign investors off? I mean, Somin, I mean, this is the sort of thing which will lose Myanmar a lot of international goodwill, and a lot of questions are being raised right now.
We should also remember that this, like for example, Lebanon case, this is the past. This is a consequence of the past. either we talk about investment or business dealings which were not transparent, which did with many unfair methods. And that I think Myanmar is going to learn, and I think the government is going to learn from that past experiences as well. That's why the commission is set up, and Aung San Suu Kyi is in the commission. Hopefully, something could be learned from the past. But this should not definitely put off the international or the regional business people who do invest, because for me, yes, the country is moving forward, but the country needs business. The country needs the international support, and this is the right time to go. Of course, it should not be underestimated or overestimated. It should be looked at as realistically as possible.
Well, you're talking about, the government trying to deal with past baggage, but really, I mean, is there a risk, Kirsten, that Myanmar could backslide on reforms? We know that, the current Speaker of the Lower House of Parliament, the former General Shwe Man, I mean, he said that the reason reform took so long in Myanmar was the fact that, the threat posed by the various ethnic insurgencies was an important factor, that the former rulers did want to develop a democratic system, but the situation just basically made it impossible. So could the army use the risk of ethnic insurgencies as an excuse to retake the country?
Well, actually, there are a lot of Burmese I've spoken to in the country who sincerely seem to believe that the army is preparing its way out should it feel the need to stage another coup, to regain its power. It sounds very negative thinking, but I've heard that many, many times over.
But for me, no. The military will not come back because it is just even for the interest of the military that military is a part of this democratization process, which military also has to deal with the other stakeholders, have to compromise with other stakeholders. At the end of the day, military has to go back to the barrack. Of course, it cannot go back to barrack now, but it has to go back to the barrack, and military has to be in the process.
Yeah, but the Constitution still allows the military wide-ranging powers, basically, to retake the country if necessary in the name of national stability, right?
Yes, that's why there is a discussion on the constitutional amendment. How this, the question, as Dr. Tin also put it out, the question is how this constitution, which was adopted forcibly in 2008, could be amended to be a part of the democratic process or to pave more for democratic reforms, including for the military reforms. Because again, at the end, military reform is also a big issue for Myanmar, will be a big issue for Myanmar.
All right.
And Lian, I have to say that at this particular time, there is really bold and courageous leadership in the country on both sides, on many, and so many different levels. And the whole thing is, how do we invest in it? Because the road of transition, economic, social, political, peace and security is multiple levels of transition. It's not going to be an easy process. The road is fragile, the road is uncertain. And obviously the whole issue of military reform is absolutely critical, and the member states around it, the ASEAN states, are trying to help. Because Indonesia, for example, have actually looked at the military and civilian reforms that country has undertaken. So it's not like they're not rethinking. I also want to stress that the government itself is not a homogeneous government. So you have different interests. Of course, you have the whole people who are driving the reform agenda in a very, very big way. There are so-called the hardliners and so on. But I want to say that even before the opening up, I was engaged with some of the hardliners who are now, or at least seen currently as a hardliners. But at that time, they were part of the reform agenda because they were trying to see how can they actually begin to open up. So I just want to say it is not a one-size-fits-all, and neither is it a homogeneous group.
Right.
And one needs to somehow be able to make sure that the people who want this reform is actually strengthened, and there are alliances with civil society, with the media, and so on.
Right. So we're listening to Nolene Hazer from the United Nations, and we're going to have to take a short break. She's saying, of course, that Myanmar's transition is going to be a tricky one. It's going to be a road which is fragile, and there are multiple levels of transition. We'll continue talking about this after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Perspectives. Now, we were talking about earlier the transition of Myanmar and the fact that it's really not a one-size-fits-all for all the stakeholders in that country. Is it a matter, given the chaos in the country right now and the fact that, there's still a lot of disparate groups which are operating and trying to make that transition, that a crucial point here is to have the military socialized into society and the system?
Yes, it is very important that military as an institution does not stay out of society. It is part of society. Of course, there's always rhetoric that military is part of the society, but apparently the way institutions are being developed during the past 2 decades made military estranged from society itself. At a very young age, they were inducted into the military as officers, and they become socialized within the military institution, and they have very little contact with outside except the families. And I think there has to be more exchanges at the higher level as well. Mm-hmm. When the National Defense College was established in the 1950s, civilian officers were there, like in any other countries. But then it became defunct, and then it came back, and only military officers were there. So at the highest level even, there was no engagement, except as a superior-inferior relationship when military officers command them, become ministers, and so on. So there's always this gap between the civil-military relations because of this kind of isolation, self-isolation, and also by the international community, which does not engage with the military because of various reasons.
So while the country actually sorts its own problems out, I mean, we've got a lot of people in the international community which is looking in from the outside. I mean, what are they making of these latest developments, you think, Kirsten? Do you think that they're looking at this as the military taking a hardline stance, and perhaps countries like the US and Congress might actually be poised to reimpose those sanctions if really push came to shove?
I don't think anyone will reimpose sanctions, because you shouldn't forget the fact that sanctions were lifted at a point when the US and the EU is in a big economic crisis. And we haven't spoken about resources yet, but Myanmar is a very resource-rich country. And not last, this is why we have ethnic conflicts. The resources are located in all those ethnic areas. And the pipelines are running through current conflict areas, right? The Arakan state, Kachin state. So I don't think anyone will be reimposing unless things go really bad.
And given the fact that, this resource is actually concentrated in a lot of the conflict areas, do you think really that foreign investors should have waited a little bit more? I mean, just look at Kachin, for instance. We had 70,000 people displaced because of the war there. I mean, a lot of the investment could actually have the potential of worsening the human rights situation there. Wouldn't you say, Nolene?
Well, the whole thing is that Myanmar is a resource-rich country. And obviously, there would be many, many interests from all sides, from India, China, Europe, US. So everybody is interested. So obviously, the whole thing is how do we ensure that we manage this investment in such a way that these investment actually generates development for the people? And how do we ensure that this is not a footloose investment that just comes in and does not create sustainable, inclusive development. And therefore, if it is an investment that can generate jobs, it does not destroy communities, it strengthens the social economic fabric of communities, it helps to strengthen the engagement and the generation of jobs, because one also has to understand that there is going to be a growing youth population, and currently there are about 45% of the people who are not employed.
So how are they going to actually improve the lives of the ordinary people? We know that a lot of the foreign direct investment is still going into resource extraction, oil and gas, copper, etc. All this is great for the government and government coffers, but as you said, it doesn't translate into jobs for the masses. It doesn't trickle down to the man in the street. So what? Somin?
It is very important from the beginning. I think we could learn a lot from other countries' experiences. From the very beginning, that when an investment is to be done, for example, in Shan State or Kachin State, the local stakeholder has to be involved, has to be consulted from the beginning. That is what we didn't do in the past. That is easy to say, but in reality, it is difficult. But that is the principle we should take. That when an investment or a business is to be done, when it comes to the natural wealth and resources of that particular region of the nationality, they have to be involved in the discussion.
Even if they are involved, I mean, do they have the experience and the wherewithal to turn a lot of this resource revenue into productive investments? What do you all think?
Well, at the beginning, they follow the line of least resistance. And whether the question is, would you want to allow hydroelectric power, oil and gas extraction to now, or let them stay on for a later date until everything is sorted out? I'm not sure that that's a good idea too, because the government is running a budget deficit and so on. So basically, the question is, how much is the government transparent? And how much is the government going to use that money for what purposes? I think that will be the crucial question. In that question, there will be debate within the community as well, within the ethnic groups that are sitting on top of this pot of gold. But for that, would there be a great blanket law, like 30-60%, blah, blah? I don't think it can happen like that too. It happens on a case-by-case basis. But there must be a general principle of some share equitable distribution of resources for those who are living within that area. And I think that's how to go. And what about others? Generating income, generating employment. Yes, if you have a hydroelectric dam, of course, it may not. If you have oil and gas extraction offshore, it may not. But then there has to be other ways and means of having small and medium businesses, some supply chains, value chains linked to Southeast Asia or ASEAN. That has to be promoted by the government and somehow let the people know. Many of the small businessmen don't know, and they are at a handicap, and they are afraid. They are afraid of FDI because they say competition is bad for us.
So, I mean, how is all this wealth going to be shared, do you think?
I honestly think that at the end of the day, much of the money also has to be invested in education, in health, in rural infrastructure, because 70% of the people are still living in the rural areas. And therefore, investment in smallholders agriculture, in farmers, in rural credit, in small and medium-sized enterprises. And that is part of the quick wins. In fact, last week, I was at the Development Cooperation Forum, and people actually talked about investment that will actually support the value chains and also the fact that we need to support small and medium-sized enterprises so that wealth is equally shared.
I think that is where the international community can come and really help in sorting out, okay, where the investment should go and how it is going to be distributed. Those in terms of, because in the transition, this, as I mentioned, is the beginning, and we all are learning how to be a part of the transition, how I run a newspaper, how I print a journal. We all are learning, and that is where we need skills and support and capacity and expertise from the other countries' experiences. For me, that is where exactly we need from the international community.
So is the government really taking enough steps, Kirsten, you think, that to ensure that progress is not going to just mean wealth accumulation for a rich elite, that this wealth is really going to be spread amongst a lot of people right across the country?
I don't think the government is yet, but maybe we also have huge expectations, and especially the Myanmar population has huge expectations. There's a very, very strong sense of impatience and of wanting to see the results now, without any understanding of how procedures work, how the new parliaments in the regions even work, how to approach their own parliamentarians to actually communicate their grievances, demands, needs. I think the international community there could, and that's probably the most important role in my view.
I could add, it is, for me, it is not only high expectation, it is mixed with distrust or dislike of the previous governments. So that is combined, and they want something immediately positive.
And that's a very, very unhealthy attitude right now. So what is actually needed is international expertise to the government and to the parliaments, including the regional parliaments, to understand what kind of laws and policies are needed to drive this development onto the right path, and also build communication channels between the grassroots, the public, and their local parliamentarians to feed this information back.
Yeah, all that needs to be done, but of course, I mean, this is really something of a gold rush into Myanmar, and a lot of people also fear that, you know, it could be bad for the country in the long term. I mean, look at Cambodia and Hun Sen. I mean, could it be a case here in Myanmar where you look at all the competing donors and investors, and the authorities will play them off each other to consolidate a new type of authoritarian regime? Nolene.
Well, currently the government has come up with an economic and social framework. So they're trying to be as coherent as possible, and they are actually in the driver's seat currently now, asking that for areas in which they need investment and where they need help. To be very honest, at this particular time, the articulation of the reform agenda is very, very good. But the implementation, the capacity building, all the way down to the regions, to the communities, will have to be improve. And the only way to do that is to be assisted by the international community, and not just the donors. We need to have also corporate governance. What type of investments are coming in? And perhaps the governments of these multinationals and so on could also put some pressure on them. There are new forms of investment, new ethical investments that are absolutely critical. I know I brought a group of ministers and deputy ministers to Singapore at the end of last year, and they were looking at affordable housing. And so really, how do you ensure that investment can actually be better aligned with development needs that will actually strengthen the foundation of economic and social reform that is so critical to a democratic agenda?
All right, we have to take another short break here. We're discussing how essentially investments will translate into real benefits for the Burmese people. Stay tuned. Thanks for staying with us on Perspectives. Now, when anyone talks about the future of Myanmar, it seems contingent on two personalities, President Thein Sein and Aung San Suu Kyi. Would you agree that there's been an over-personalization of politics in Myanmar, that it simply rests on the shoulders of these two people? Let's start with you, Tim.
Yes, but it is also inevitable in this stage. So the big question is the transition and how to groom second-line leaders and so on. I think democracy, as you know, when it works well when there are mediocre leaders too. Democracy should work with mediocre leaders. That's the beauty of democracy. You don't need an extremely bright leader all the time. You can't have it. So in the case of Myanmar and many other developing countries, in the beginning you do need people who are selfless, who are very intelligent, who are very charismatic. But I think the followers especially should not sit in the comfort zone and outsource everything to them, and by the time they are gone, you are left holding the baby.
Would you agree that, essentially democracy needs mediocre leaders, but, I mean, beyond that, obviously, have the incumbents really sort of groomed or nurtured a second line of leaders? Nolene.
Well, I would say democracy needs good institutions, and that we need very powerful leaders in the first stage, because it is moving from a dictatorship, if you like, to one that is more, at least has more engagement with citizens. But at the same time, to deliver for citizenship, to make sure that there is good governance, to make sure that democracy and the peace dividend and the development dividend and the reform dividend actually reaches people, you need to have very good institutions. And therefore, that is the transition. How do we build the capacities? How do we have the legal frameworks? How do we have the right laws? How do we have the right frameworks whereby these things, these goals of democracy, peace and development could be further developed?
Right.
So leadership is important, but so are institutions.
Yeah,
I would rephrase what I said. What I actually meant is democracy must survive mediocre leaders. Because you can't say that you need mediocre leaders, but democracy must be able to work with mediocre leaders because of institutions.
I think the point is that you need inclusiveness, and therefore an inclusive
But you need to have understanding what actually, what party politics are, what party programs are. And I don't think there's any understanding, not even among the leaders or the parliamentarians, let alone the public.
So do you think the politics is organized enough, as you say? I mean, if we really need good institutions, we need good political players. And really right now, when you cast your eye across the scene, the other dominant political actors are former military officials, released political prisoners, leaders of certain ethnic groups. Would you say that the younger generation in Myanmar are properly represented right now?
No, no. That is the big challenge for the democratization in the country. One is, when we talk of institution, there is no good enough institution at all. Either we look at the political parties, either ruling party or opposition party, Nationally for Democracy, they are not political institution as yet. They need to be built if it is to be in the nation building. Plus the youth. Myanmar has a big number of population as for the youth. And where are they? And very good that they are very active. They want to do something. They want to be in the process. But what is their role? They really need to be focused so that they are equipped. They have the opportunities. Of course, the sector, we all agree, education, health. And then they need to be leading. They need to be leading in the process itself.
Yes.
And then that has to be done by all the stakeholders, not only the government, but also civil society groups, Nationally for Democracy. That has to be done. So whatever the programs we do, this has to be, this focus of the youth for future has to be a part of this, a big main part of this.
So how are the youth going to be involved in organized politics, and what are the implications if they're not, number one? Number two, you know, Aung San Suu Kyi in the by-election campaigning last year, she was saying that essentially it was a huge task to try to educate the average Myanmar person about democracy, that really they're not clued in into the basics of the democratic process. So we have a huge young generation and perhaps people who are not yet or have not yet embraced the practices of democracy. Where do we go from here?
Well, I would say that actually it's also the fact that there are people returning home, and if we are talking about youth, the youth have also got to be the drivers of this reform agenda. And what is absolutely critical is the expectations. How do you manage the expectations of all these different stakeholders in a big way? And if you look at the way the parliament is functioning, it's still in a learning process. In fact, I think it was Dr. Cho who actually mentioned, when we talked about checks and balances, there are more checks then there are balances, and therefore, you know, it is going to be a learning process.
All right. I want to bring in the issue of the Rohingyas here. I just want to switch tact for a moment. We know that there's some 800,000 of them of Bengali origin and heritage who live in the Rakhine state in West Myanmar, who are by and large shunned by the Myanmar people. And essentially, the United Nations has called these people one of the most persecuted in the world today. Aung San Suu Kyi, she's uncharacteristically stayed pretty silent and neutral on the issue. Why do you think that is?
Because she's a politician.
So what does she have that her eye on the prize of, essentially winning the 2015 election, and that she's not going to be jeopardizing her chances by speaking up on behalf of the Rohingya?
That's possibly the reason, because that seems, the Rohingya issue seems to be the only issue where everybody across the wide spectrum of politics is totally united, sadly enough.
Against them.
So against them, yes. So you have very critical voices everywhere, and every Burmese I've spoken to says, no, they're not part of us. So I don't see any solution at this point. So if you start speaking out for them, even though obviously their human rights are being violated, then it will be very difficult for you to go forwards within Myanmar politics. So I think.
Would you all agree that Aung San Suu Kyi is looking at having a bigger parliamentary voice so as to really reform the country in the long term, and this human rights problem has to be ignored for the moment?
She's a politician, and she will definitely look at the votes, but I don't think that is not the only one. That the Rohingya issue is a very complex one. It is years of corruption, border security with Bangladesh. Both Bangladesh and Myanmar are responsible for this as well, and also the society as such, Burman Buddhist society. That is the issue as well. At least I can say partly Burman Buddhist, Arakan Buddhist, and then the religious aspect is there. So I would say, for me, she cannot take up. How she can take up the issue? But of course, this issue has to be dealt by her as well. She has to do something. Because being a politician doesn't mean that she doesn't say. She has to do that. But it is not easy to say because it's really a societal issue as well.
Yes.
And then another one is when we look at from the international community perspective, Rohingya issue is just one of the most persecuted people. No. It's more than that and it's beyond that as well. It is also a regional issue. It will become a regional security issue if the international community and neighboring countries doesn't help Myanmar to sort it out.
All right, still a lot of work to be done, obviously. We've got 2 minutes to go before the end of the show. I just want to have a quick round with our guest here. Essentially, would you say that, 2012, I mean, how would you characterize 2013 for Myanmar? 2012 was a year of hope and change. Is the honeymoon sort of over for Myanmar? Will 2013 be a year of crackdowns and protests? Let's start with you, Kirsten.
I think, yes, the honeymoon period is certainly over, and now everybody waits for the Myanmar government to really deliver on its promises and really put those policies and laws into place, and that's going to be a huge challenge. But I set my hopes on the young generation we have been talking about so much. They have most of the potential, and we need to help them to go that way.
Tin, quick word from you.
Well, uncertainties, yes. And then, of course, the expectations will come to roost. And I think the government has learned not to be promising too much. But they still have to be held on what they have promised very early, which sometimes are a little bit difficult to perform. And I think it will be a year of disappointment, maybe, for some who are supporting the government too, because, as you say, there was more discontent and you have to deal with all these little things going to happen. Yeah. But I think the fortitude and the patience, probably that's one of the strengths of U Thein Sein.
Very quick word from you, Nolene, a more complex year for Myanmar.
I would say that 2013 is a year of preparation and consolidation because they are preparing to take over the chair of ASEAN in 2014. And therefore, it is a tremendous opportunity for them to align themselves in order to close development gaps and also to be aligned to some of the norms and standards of the ASEAN and with the international community. At the same time, they are also trying to open up and to learn from ASEAN and also beyond. And the idea of hosting the World Economic Forum in June of this year is a good way of bringing more ideas into the country. This is a time for ideas. This is a time for the international community to invest in the reform agenda.
Final word to Somin.
Yeah, for me, this is the year for the implementation of what has been said and what has been gained through the openings. And we really need to implement what had been said over.
All right, thank you to all my guests for joining us. Nolene Hazer from the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, So Min from Mazima News, Tidmong Montan from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, and Kirsten Duell from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. It wasn't long ago that Myanmar was spoken of in much the same way as the likes of North Korea, authoritarian, secretive, corrupt. But after months of rapid change, the Southeast Asian debutante has everyone excited. Is this, as some watchers have put it, irrational exuberance? Or will this time go down in Myanmar's history as a real turning point at which things started looking up? We hope you found our discussion thought-provoking. Do help us shape the next episode of Perspectives. You can write or connect with us by leaving your comments on our website, and you can tweet us as well, of course. I'm Lian Pek. Till our next edition of Perspectives. Thanks for watching.